Okay, so now I want to lead into the discussion about consumer and producer surplus. So on the last slide, we determined that there was a tax. Sorry, my contact bothered me. We determined that there was a tax, but we showed that the supply curve shifted up, but that the price, the new equilibrium price, is somewhere between the old equilibrium price and the old equilibrium price plus the tax. Okay. So we want to see how does that affect consumers and how does that affect producers. Okay. So if we're using, hey there. If we're using the $1 tax, if we're being consistent, I had this little chart here. For each unit, without the tax, the old equilibrium price was P star for consumers, for producers, and consumers paid P star. Okay. Now, with the tax, producers are getting P prime, the new equilibrium price, but they have to give away $1 of tax. Okay. Consumers are paying P prime. Okay. So if we're going to look at the graph real quick. Actually, let me do this on a different one so that I can make it bigger. So let me do this on whiteboard. Where'd it go? Okay. So if we have our demand, our supply, we have price, we have quantity, we have style, we have class. We shift up the supply curve. Let me not put that there. For reasons I'll explain later. We shift up the supply curve by S plus 1. Okay. This is P star plus 1. This is Q star. Okay. This is P star and this is P prime. Okay. So this is what P prime is, what producers face. Or sorry, what consumers pay. What consumers pay. It's also what producers charge, but I want to do this. Okay. And then, so after the tax, what happens? So for every unit, producers, even though they're charging P prime, they're only getting back P prime minus 1. Or you could say P prime minus the tax. That's an arrow key. What producers get back after tax. I should say just get. What the producers get per good after the tax. So they pay the tax of $1. Oh, hey. They pay the tax of $1 and they charge P prime, so they get P prime minus 1. Okay. So if we were to look back on this, so that's where these numbers are coming from, right? So we call the tax burden it's tax burden per unit. The difference between P star, what producers would have gotten, so this is the producer tax burden, what producers would have gotten in the absence of a tax minus what they're getting with the tax. So that is the producer tax burden, and it's less than the amount of the tax. Okay. And what consumers are getting is P star minus P prime. So they would have gotten, P prime minus P star, right? They would have gotten their willingness to pay minus P star as their consumer surplus. Now they're getting their willingness to pay minus P prime as their consumer surplus. So the difference between that, the loss in consumer surplus for each unit is going to be P prime minus P star. So that'd be less than, each of these is less than the amount of the tax. Okay. So let me make this bigger. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to label a few different areas that I've divided up. Okay. So A, A, B, C, D, C. I wanted to cut through so that it's clear that it's this rectangle and not this rectangle divided by this triangle. So let me actually even make it bigger. C, D. My cat has joined us to graph these tax. Say hi. Say hi, buddy. Okay, so I need two more. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P. There's E, and we need one more. F. Hard to see, but F is the area above this little dotted line above the old equilibrium price. Okay. So the reason I said, the reason it's significant is that of this being less than 1 is that by virtue of there being a tax of $1, producers aren't facing the whole tax burden. They're not losing all of their surplus as a result of the tax. Some of that's being shifted on the consumers. So even though the producers pay some of the tax or pay the whole tax, by virtue of them increasing the price, some of the tax burden is shifted onto consumers. So what exactly do I mean? I mean that there's going to be some loss in consumer surplus as a result of the tax, even though the tax is on producers. Okay. There's also going to be some loss in producer surplus for obvious reasons. Okay. So let me do this. Before I move on to the next bullet point, let's take a look at this. So if I'm looking at total surplus, right? And I want it before the tax, that's going to be A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F, right? It was just the area between the supply and demand curve, essentially, right? If I'm looking for consumer surplus before the tax, what was that? Consumer surplus is the difference between the demand curve and the equilibrium price, where the old equilibrium price was P star. So that should be A plus B plus F. What about the producer surplus before the tax? That would be between the equilibrium price of P star, that's the old equilibrium price, and then the supply curve, so it should be C plus D plus E. D plus E. Okay, so A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F is your total surplus. A plus B plus F is your producer surplus. C plus D plus E is your, I think I said producer surplus earlier. A plus B plus F is your consumer surplus. C plus D plus E is your producer surplus. Okay, let me get that out of the way, my big old head. Okay, what about now that there's a tax? Okay, producers get P prime minus 1, right? Stop. I don't know why my alarm just went off, but okay. Producers get P prime minus 1. Sorry, the alarm set made me lose my train of thought. Okay, so they pay $1 in tax and they get P prime. Okay, so the producer surplus should only be what the producers are making per good. Okay, so that, I would say, is between P prime minus 1 and D, or P prime minus 1 in the supply curve, D. Okay. Okay. Consumers pay P prime, right? That's the amount that they're charged. Okay. So their willingness to pay minus the equilibrium price for them is going to be the demand curve minus P prime. So consumer surplus after the tax is equal to A. Okay. What is B and C? Right? B and C is area that used to be part of consumer and producer surplus. C used to be part of producer, B used to be part of consumer. That's now going to the government. Okay? B and, or I should say, area between P prime and P prime minus 1 is the tax collected by government. Okay. So government revenue, aka the tax revenue, I'm just going to call it tax revenue, is equal to B plus C. Okay. Where B comes out of consumer surplus and C comes out of producer surplus. Oh, there we go. Okay. So what we call B is going to be, no pun intended, so that is why we call B producer tax burden. I'm sorry, B was consumer tax burden. And C then is producer tax burden. Okay? Why is it a burden? Because it used to be part of consumer surplus. Okay? So why is B a burden? Because it used to be part of consumer surplus. Why is C a burden? Because it used to be part of producer surplus. And obviously, why is B consumer tax burden? Because it used to be consumer surplus. Okay? So the total tax revenue, aka tax burden, is B plus C, where B was from consumers, so we call that the consumer tax burden. C was from producers, so we call that the producer tax burden. Okay? So the tax revenue is B plus C, okay? And that's what the government gets back. And maybe the government wants to, so let's say it's the soda tax. Maybe the amount of the tax burden or the tax revenue was going to fund, schools or something like that. Or maybe they collect the tax. So this would be the example of, I gave it earlier when I was talking about externalities. So maybe they're collecting a tax on carbon emissions and they're paying it back directly to consumers, right? So the A plus B plus C would be the total benefit for consumers, even though A is just the consumer surplus, or even though just A is consumer surplus. Okay. So what the government does with their tax revenue, B and C, ultimately depends on, what the government does with the tax in reality, right? So you can imagine that sometimes they might give it back to consumers, sometimes they might give it back to producers, sometimes it just goes to fund the government. And, maybe you have a corrupt government where it never goes back to anybody, and either producers or consumers. It just goes directly to Muammar Gaddafi or something like that. But presumably, the tax revenue is used to fund something good. You would hope, at least. Okay, so there's some tax revenue, B plus C, that is not part of consumer producer surplus anymore. Okay. And then finally we have E and F, which just like with price controls is deadweight loss. Okay. So E and F is a result of the shift in from quantity that happened as a result of the tax. So there used to be more people buying the good. Okay. So I guess I should have your Q prime over here. So the number of people buying the good shifted from Q star to Q prime, okay, meaning that there are less people buying the good. So these people in E and F are neither getting producer surplus or consumer surplus because they're not buying or selling the good. So they're not getting any profit per good for the producers, and they're not getting any willingness to pay minus price paid for the consumers. So E and F is deadweight loss. In fact, I'm going to write it out. Dead, just in case you forgot what it was. Deadweight loss. Okay. So taxes have a lot going on here. Okay. We have some price for consumers. Usually I go ahead and I refer to this as P cons. Even though this is the price, the sticker price, this is what producers are technically charging. But it's the price that consumers pay, essentially. And I usually refer to this as P prod for producers, because even though they're charging P cons, they're charging P prime, producers are only getting back P prime minus the amount of the tax. So I call it P prod. Okay. So essentially, it's almost like there are two prices, even though there's only one, this price P prime here. It's like that there are two prices because producers are only getting back a certain amount of the what they're charging. Okay. So the consumer surplus has gone from A plus B to F to just A now. A now, you're an all-star. It's going from A plus B plus F to just A. Okay. B is now being collected from consumers as part of their tax burden. F is just deadweight loss. Consumers aren't buying, the difference between Q prime and Q star, so they're not receiving a consumer surplus. So the consumer surplus is just A. Okay. Producer surplus is now just D. Okay. Producers are only getting back P prime minus 1. So the difference between their equilibrium price that they receive and the supply curve is just D. C is going over to the producer tax burden. And then E is just deadweight loss because producers between Q prime and Q star aren't selling their good. Okay. And then total surplus is just going to be A plus D. Alternatively, if you wanted to say total surplus is A plus B plus C plus D, I would accept that. That's a perfectly fine answer. That just assumes that someone's getting back this B plus C, which is a fair assumption that tax revenue is ultimately going to either producers or consumers. But I would rather just stick to A plus D. And then total surplus, the deadweight loss, is going to be decreasing by E plus F. Okay. So just taking it back to the slide, what is the total tax burden? The tax burden is going to be your tax times your quantity sold. So B plus C. the tax is what? P prime minus P prime minus 1. Let me write that down. Tax burden is equal to P prime minus P prime minus 1 right, for one individual unit. For the total tax burden, it'll be times your Q, okay? So above here, you have the producer tax burden and the consumer tax burden per unit. And if we were to look at the slideshow, if we were to look at the graph versus that, right? Look at the consumer tax burden. It's P prime minus P star times the quantity produced, or the quantity produced after the tax. Look at the producer tax burden. It's going to be P star minus P prime minus 1. This area here is C. And this will be times the quantity produced at equilibrium, Q prime. Okay, so this was per unit. Now we're not. Now we're doing it for overall. Okay. If we simplify the tax burden, right? So you have P prime minus P prime plus 1. If we distribute out the minus sign here, right? This will be minus P prime, and then this will be plus 1 times Q times Q. So this will be 1 times Q. Okay. Then I'm going to be specific. I want Q prime since that's the new equilibrium quantity. Okay. So another way of saying that, your tax burden in general is going to be your tax times Q prime. Our tax just happened to be 1 here. Okay. So your tax times your quantity sold is your tax burden. And 1 times Q is your tax burden in this case. So the total tax burden is going to be this area here, which, like I said, was B plus C in the graph that we did. Okay, this is probably a nicer looking graph. Okay. The change in consumer surplus as a result of the tax is going to be this orange area and this deadweight loss here, where this orange area is your consumer surplus, P prime minus P star. And look, P prime minus P star is the per unit consumer tax burden. And then P star minus P prime minus 1 times Q star. So that's going to be your producer tax burden. Okay. So I'm going to stop the lecture there. Next week we're going to do an example. It'll probably just refresh you immediately, just to jump right in. And yeah, that's the end of this lecture for now. All right. Then we're going to also do consumer theory. Okay.